Okay, so the broad motivation for this project is that there are large and persistent racial disparities in employment rates in the US. So, for example, since about the 1960s, Black unemployment rates have roughly doubled the overall unemployment rate. We actually don't know much about what's causing this. Uh, while there's been a lot of work studying racial disparities in wages, there's actually been much less work looking at disparities in employment outcomes or employment rates. And what this paper is looking at is one old idea for one potential cause of these disparities in employment rates. And that's what's called the spatial mismatch hypothesis, which originates back in the late 1960s. There's a few versions of the spatial mismatch hypothesis, but the basic idea is that you have Black workers concentrated in segregated Black neighborhoods, typically in the central cities of metropolitan areas. And you have job opportunities, particularly after World War II, becoming increasingly concentrated in suburban areas, so moving from the central city to the suburbs. And the idea of spatial mismatch here is you have mismatch between where Black workers are living and where their potential job opportunities exist. And so what this paper is doing is it's testing this hypothesis. And in particular, what I do is I ask, if we look at job suburbanization from 1970 to 2000, so in particular, changes in the geographic distribution of where jobs are located, moving from the central city to the suburbs, did that cause declines in Black employment rates and Black earnings? And so to get at that, I combine two sources of data. So I use data from the decennial census from 1970 to 2000. I also use establishment level data from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from about the same period. And what I do is a few things, but the basic idea is look at variation across metropolitan areas in the rates of job suburbanization over this period. So in some cities, there's a lot more movement of work from central cities to the suburbs than others. And the question is that variation across cities associated with variation in relative declines in Black employment rates and Black earnings? And in general, what I find is indeed there is a connection there. So for every 10% decline in the share of jobs located in the central city, Black employment rates decline relative to white employment rates by about 2%. And broadly, that could, if you take those estimates seriously, the job suburbanization that we see over this period could explain over half of relative declines in Black employment rates for Black men in particular, which declined by about 10% relative to employment rates for white men from 1970 to 2000. One key concern with interpreting that correlation between job suburbanization and changes in Black employment rates is that there might be other changes happening in these metropolitan areas. So there might be some structural changes in cities that see more movement of work from the central city to the suburbs that even in the absence of changes in geography would have led to changes in Black relative employment rates, say changes in what kinds of sectors are represented in those metropolitan areas, or say some shock to labor supply that predicts where firms relocate. And so I do a couple of things to try and address that potential concern. The main thing is I use variation in interstate highway infrastructure as a sort of instrument for changes in suburbanization across metropolitan areas. So this is building on work by Nate Baum-Snow in his 2007 QJA paper looking at the relationship between interstate highways and suburbanization. What I do is essentially use that same research design to show that when you have metropolitan areas that are more exposed to the interstate highway system, that leads to increased rates of job suburbanization. And that also leads to increases in the gaps between Black and white workers in terms of employment rates, roughly consistent with what you find just in the kind of baseline OLS estimates. Another exercise that I do that I think supports a causal interpretation of job suburbanization on Black relative employment rates is I use the EEOC establishment level data and show that when we look at establishments that relocate from central cities to suburbs within metropolitan areas over this period, what you see is immediately coinciding with those movements, with those relocations, steep declines in the Black share of employees in those firms. So the idea is take the same firm that's relocating from downtown to some suburban area. What you see is with those relocations, the Black share of employees at those same firms drop sharply after those relocations. And the magnitude of those changes is roughly consistent with what you see with the kind of metropolitan level variation in job suburbanization. And so overall, what you find is it looks like over this period from 1970 to 2000, job suburbanization led to large declines in Black relative employment rates over this period.